All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm NCPER's Executive Director, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's session. We have a full agenda to talk about key federal and state policies that have been reviewed, maybe enacted, and then we will spend a balance of our time looking forward to 2026. But before we get started with the formal programming, I do want to spend a minute talking about our upcoming 2026 Legislative Conference and Policy Day. This is our annual industry gathering in Washington, D.C. to make or reinforce connections with your members of Congress and remind federal policymakers to turn to you, their constituents, when issues of public pensions, state and local tax, or broader retirement policies arise in Congress. Registration for the 2026 Legislative Conference and Policy Day is currently open, and we encourage you to join us in January. Policy Day this year features an updated structure where Capitol Hill meetings will take place across 2 days, giving you, the participants, more flexibility and more opportunities to meet with your congressional delegations. So as we always do with our webinars, we do want to make this session interactive and engaging. We do ask for your questions, so please submit your questions through the Q&A function on this webinar. But for this one, we've also added a number of polling questions to sort of gauge where all of our attendees today, where you are on sort of relative to some of the issues that we have on tap. So the first poll that we're going to talk about and put on the screen is whether you plan on attending our 2026 Legislative Conference and Policy Day. So we'll give you a few moments to complete the poll. All right. Great. So we have a number of folks saying that that they won't be able to attend, but we have a significant number of folks that will be there or aren't sure yet. So this is a great start and great sense of who is on the webinar today. So joining me, we have a distinguished panelist of Angela Rowe with NCSL and Tony Rhoda with Williams & Jensen. I'll start with a quick bio overview of them, and then we'll start with the questioning. So Angela Rowe is a senior policy specialist focusing on pensions, retirement, and public sector employment issues with NCSL. Previously, Angela worked at the Colorado House of Representatives and State Senate. Tony Rhoda has over 20 years of experience representing state and local government plans, including state, county, and municipal systems. In addition, he has provided training on fiduciary responsibilities and drafted ethics materials. He is a frequent speaker at national and international conferences and have written numerous articles on matters affecting public pensions. Angela, Tony, as always, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. Angela, let me start with you and ask you to quickly provide an overview of NCSL for folks who may not be familiar with what your organization does.
Sure. So we are NCSL, National Conference of State Legislatures, are a nonpartisan member-based organization. And essentially what we do is work to advance the integrity, the independence, and the effectiveness of state legislatures. We also work to foster interstate cooperation and facilitate the exchange of information among legislatures in the 50 US states and territories. So that's kind of just a brief overview, and I'm happy to talk more about what I do specifically later on.
Yeah, and so let me ask, so in the capacity of your position at NCSL and sort of the resources that NCSL brings to bear, How do you track and support state level pensions and retirement policy?
Yes, that's a great question. So, in terms of tracking and supporting pension policy and retirement policy, we conduct bill tracking and maintain a legislative database on a wide variety of topics related to public pensions. On our public facing side, our database for pensions and retirement just focuses on enacted legislation. Um, 2023 and previous years, we focused on all legislation, but as you can imagine, the volume of legislation was massive. So we've kind of scaled that down to make it more accessible for folks. And as I mentioned, NCSL is very strictly nonpartisan, so we can't specifically support or advocate for policies or legislation related to pensions and retirement. But what we can do and what we do is support legislators and legislative staff by responding to research requests on a variety of subject matters. We conduct trainings. We organize and facilitate meetings. We provide technical assistance and legislative testimony. We also produce various written resources and online resources, so policy briefs, webinars, podcasts. So, in a nutshell, really my role and everyone's role at NCSL in the Policy and Research Division is to just provide clear, nonpartisan analysis, research, and comparative state insights to help legislators and legislative staff craft informed, effective pension and retirement policy.
Fantastic, Angela. And we're going to be talking in depth about all the things you've been tracking. Let me just turn to Tony and ask similarly, Tony, can you tell us a little bit more about Williamson Jensen and your role there and what you've been doing over the last 20 years to support public sector pensions?
Absolutely, Hank. And again, thanks for having us and having me back. Williams and Jensen is a DC-based law firm. We are also highly integrated into the lobbying community, and a lot of our work is federal lobbying. So that's the basic blocking and tackling of federal legislation. And as much as you're an advocate for or against a certain legislative proposal. I also work very closely with my clients and others on regulatory developments, which come from the Treasury and the IRS to implement the legislation that's ultimately enacted. And as I think we all know, the legislation is enacted with lots of question marks still in it. Not literally, but when you go to implement it, you have a lot of practical day-to-day questions as to how to do it. So the guidance we get from Treasury and IRS is critical. I also work with state plans on certain proposals before the states, not to certainly lobby, but to analyze, and in the context of the federal tax law as to whether it would be would it jeopardize your qualified status, essentially? A lot of these questions come down to whether a particular state proposal would abridge in any way the exclusive benefit rule. So those are the kinds of things that we get involved with, and it's been a tremendous opportunity to work with this community for 20 plus years now.
Great, Tony. Thank you. So, yeah, so obviously we have a lot to talk about both at the state level and at the federal level. So let me switch back to Angela and ask you, from your vantage point, obviously we're at the end of the year. At the state level, what were sort of the themes or sort of major issue areas that you were covering in 2025? And maybe you could start off with sort of a 10,000 foot overview, and then we can start drilling down a little bit later.
Absolutely. So from what we've seen at NCSL this year, and this includes legislation that we've been tracking, it includes recent policy and regulatory changes, current events, information requests. I would say that the policy trends in 2025 have been dominated largely by legislation related to funding and investments, reemployment after retirement legislation, changes to pension plan design and benefits, and then ESG. So we've seen a lot of states sort of making efforts to shore up fragile funding levels through funding policy reforms, a growing interest in, and in some states, a kind of a reliance on alternative investments, including private equity, private debt. We've also seen, as I mentioned, consistent moves to kind of ease post-retirement rules that are in effort to address workforce shortages in critical sectors. And again, ongoing shifts in plan design, which includes new hybrid plan tiers, attempt to reopen DB plans, initiatives to open DC plans in lieu of other types of plans, and then increased ESG legislation. Although I will say we've seen less ESG legislation introduced and enacted this year than in previous years, but an uptick in legislation specifically related to divestment. So it's kind of the 10,000 foot view. And yeah, we can dig more into that later on.
Great. And then in like it, again, more at the 10,000 foot level, but like, how would you characterize the overall pace and direction of state legislative activity? Would you say 2025 was a banner year, more of a typical year, or was it slightly less active?
I would say it was kind of on trend with what we've seen in terms of the volume of legislation that we've seen both introduced and enacted. The categories that we tracked enacted legislation has shifted a little bit this year. So, for example, we've seen more legislation enacted related to funding and investments this year. It was kind of the category where we saw the most enacted legislation. Last year, it was reemployment after retirement. So we're also kind of seeing a lot of states making more focused adjustments rather than sweeping reforms. So I guess I would say fine-tuning policies to kind of shore up fragile funding status. Again, easing reemployment after retirement rules, experimenting with new tiers and hybrid structures to balance costs and benefits, modernizing government or governance structure. So I would say it's been on trend, but the activity is pretty steady and responsive, and it's also becoming or has become, as we near the end of the year, more increasingly targeted.
Got it. Great. Thank you, Angela, for that overview. Yeah, we'll come back to you, and then we'll start focusing on the issues that you think are the most important that the audience should be aware of. But Tony, let me turn to you and ask you to give us sort of a 10,000 foot overview of the federal activity and the things that state and local plans should be aware of what Congress and the federal government um, activities in 2025.
Sure. So at the highest level legislatively in Congress, there was not a lot of activity on pension and retirement issues. That's not a surprise, given that in 2019, the Secure Act was enacted, and that included 30 new tax provisions related to retirement and pensions. And then, hard on its heels in 2022, the Secure Act 2.0 was enacted, which had over 90 separate tax provisions. So a lot of the work wasn't done in Congress this year, but was being done at the Treasury and the IRS in the way of implementing guidance, which I mentioned earlier, and how important that is. There have been some discussions, and we'll get into that when we talk about next year. But those discussions have been in a bipartisan way, and that's very, very important to recognize and to be appreciative for in our community, is that the pension retirement issues in Congress largely, and there are exceptions, but largely are bipartisan products that are developed with input from both parties. And I think it's easy to understand why. When you look at the constituencies of retirees and near retirees, they are more likely to vote. Many fortunate ones are in a position to make political contributions and be active politically. So this is a very ready-made constituency for Congress to want to pay attention to. And it's only increasing. So I saw this statistic this morning. It was given by a witness at a hearing yesterday in the Senate. And I'll just read it. 11,400 Americans will turn 65 each day between 2024 and 2027, which is remarkable. But really, I think bolsters the point that this constituency cannot be ignored by Congress.
Right. So Tony, great. Thanks for that overview. I'm going to stay with you and ask you to, okay, now delve into some of the issues in 2025 that you've been tracking that our members would love to hear a little bit more detail on.
Yeah, again, on the regulatory side, and this has been an exercise to follow the money. In each of these cases, there are large amounts of money at stake and in play. ESG, DEI, and the new proposal on alternative investments. So with ESG, we've known now for, I would say, maybe 10 years that it is a lightning rod on the right. It is a tremendous fundraising tool on the right. ESG has brought in a tremendous amount of money to groups that oppose any type of pro-ESG investing, and that's just continued. So what we have is a continuation of the attacks on ESG investing. The Trump administration, on day one, pulled out of the Paris Accord and set the stage for a new regulation on ESG investing. It will undo the Biden administration regulation. We continue this pendulum, this seesaw between Republican and Democratic administrations. But ESG, absolutely, we're going to see a new proposed rule from the Trump administration next year. DEI, why? DEI where's the money in DEI? Well, just look at the settlements that the federal government has entered into with big universities. Columbia University, $221 million, Northwestern, $75 million, Cornell, $30 million. Part of the attacks on these institutions were that they were doing too much on the DEI side and that they were threatening the educational integrity in the classroom and the curriculum. And as part of these settlements, these institutions and many others have pledged to not pursue DEI initiatives going forward. So that's where the money lies there. Is there bleed over into public plans in this area? Thus far, we haven't seen it. There have been plenty of ready targets in the educational community. So we hope to stay off the radar for a little bit longer, at least. But certainly those folks out there who are interested in settlements and in turning the screws on entities are certainly looking for a broader pool. And then alternative investments, which is probably the biggest, and without doubt, the biggest pool of money involved. August the 7th, an executive order went out. Trump asked the Department of Labor to promulgate new regulations to provide more of a runway, more fiduciary protections, a template or safe harbor on alternative investments being added to the investment menu of a defined contribution plan. Now, this is 401k related, purely at the moment, and ERISA related. But once these regulations are put into place and fiduciaries in the private sector have this template, right, a checklist, if I do these things, then I can make these investments available on the investment menu without fear of litigation or successful litigation. I think that bleeds over into the public space, and we've talked about that and how participants in 403B and 457B governmental plans will probably be pushing for these same types of investment opportunities. So just to sum up, it's really been a follow the money year, and I think it'll continue to be.
Great. Thank you, Tony, for that analysis on the regulatory front. Angela, let me turn it back over to you, and I'll give you sort of dealer's choice. Where do you want to start in terms of getting into details on themes that you've noticed in 2025?
Maybe, if it's okay with you, I'll start with funding and investments, because again, as I mentioned, this is a category that we saw a lot of enacted legislation this year. and current events. I'm sure if we're all paying attention to the news related to pensions, there's been a lot of conversation about alternative investments becoming, a larger percentage of pension asset portfolios. So yeah, maybe I'll start there and then given time, I can talk a little bit more about some of the other trends. So when it comes to funding and investments, I would say, states are really sort of feeling the urgency, I think, because even though we have sort of seen this improved funded ratio nationally, I think right now estimated to be between 83 and 86%, which, on its face looks really good. A lot of, the current funded ratio is heavily dependent on strong recent market gains and a handful of firms. So any market downturn could quickly change the situation. So I think the sheer scale of unfunded liabilities, which I think is around still 1.2 trillion is the current estimation. I think that keeps a lot of pressure on lawmakers to continue to act. And I think this has prompted reforms to amortization schedules, as we've seen with an omnibus bill in Minnesota, contribution rate reform, governance structure reform. So, I think this is a trend that will continue into 2026, but certainly an area where we've seen a lot of momentum this year. And as I mentioned, even though the overall funded ratio nationally looks good, the vast majority of pension plans, state and municipal pension plans in the US are in a fragile and a distressed state. So I think this is also kind of what is prompting a lot of states to look at, different strategies to address pension solvency, and to improve their funded ratios.
Great. Yeah, speaking of which, this is slightly, I guess, pulling the curtain back and peaking in 2026, but are you hearing, conversations about, budgetary concerns or constraints going into 2026, or I guess it would be fiscal year 2027 for many states, July 1 through June 30th?
Yeah, I would say that that is something, and our fiscal team at NCSL tracks this a lot more closely than I do, but obviously there's a lot of overlap with pensions and fiscal policy. It's definitely something that we've seen and have heard a lot in a handful of states, actually in say more than a handful of states. And just to give an example, where I am right now in Colorado, there's been conversation about budget deficits and talk of cutting para payments in 2026 to help pay for some of the raises that are required by some collective bargaining agreements in the state, which, in the short term could save some money and give the state a little bit of breathing room, but in the long term could cost the state more. So yes, Colorado is an example of a state that's, having ongoing conversations and a recent proposal to make those payment cuts to address that budget deficit. And then we've seen not the exact same kind of activity in other states, but certainly a lot of states that are concerned about, budget deficits. And then I think also just the market volatility and funded status kind of being in a really fragile state. There's a lot of conversation about what states can do moving forward to address that, given the current funded status of a lot of pension plans and ongoing budget deficits in a lot of the states where there are poorly funded pension plans.
Great. Thanks for that, Angela. I'll take this moment to ask again for folks who have questions for our panelists. Please submit them using the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. That can be found on the bottom of your screen. There is, as you will see, a navigation bar, and one of the functions will be the Q&A. So our expert panelists would be happy to hear your questions and answer your questions throughout the session. So Angela, let me stay with you. So what else are you tracking, and what else should our attendees be aware of?
Yeah, I did mention, reemployment after retirement. I think this is in a large part due to workforce pressures that we're seeing in the public sector. A lot of states still, as was true last year and previous years, facing issues with recruitment and retention, skills shortages, job shortages, particularly in hard to fill positions in critical sectors. We see this a lot in education, we see it in public safety. So there have been several states that have taken action around reemployment after retirement, essentially just kind of opening new pathways for retirees to return to work without losing their pension benefits in specific circumstances. And these changes don't necessarily address the long-term recruitment and retention issues, but they do offer a relatively quick and cost-effective way to kind of stabilize essential services and fill skill shortages and workforce shortages in critical sectors. Tennessee, just to name one example, recently, one of their policies is a 70% return to work program for hard to fill sectors. Delaware has also made some changes. I think these are just examples of how pension policy in some situations can be leveraged to kind of stabilize essential services and address issues with recruitment and retention. And then one other thing I'll mention, certainly ESG, I think Tony will probably talk a little bit more about that, but changes to benefit design and plan design. This is something we've seen at NCSL. It's a very common trend. But I will say something that has been interesting this year is there's been more activity or more conversation in the states about considering hybrid plans. And I think a lot of states, particularly in states with really stressed funded status of their pension plans, are looking at ways they can fine tune existing policies, ways that they can combine the benefits of a DB plan and a DC plan to kind of both provide pension benefits while balancing the cost of providing those benefits. Alaska, obviously, I know I mentioned this last year. This is another state that's kind of been in the news a lot, and I think will continue to be. They're considering reopening their defined benefit plan. It's different than the plan that was that existed pre-2006. There's some different policies, guardrails, but essentially, they've been facing a lot of issues with recruitment and retention, a lot of brain drain in Alaska, a lot of people being trained there for certain sectors and then leaving the state. And so one of the things that they've been continuing to pursue is opening a DB plan. It would be, again, different than the pre-2006. It would be something that folks could opt into, but as an effort or in effort to potentially address some of these recruitment and retention challenges that the state is facing.
Great. Thank you, Angela. So Tony, let me turn back to you. Anything else relative to sort of looking backwards in our rearview mirror relative to 2025?
I can draw some inferences on what we've seen with the focus on, as I said, follow the money, to a couple of issues that we thought might arise in the tax bill. So the one big beautiful bill. We were on a high alert, of course, for the unrelated business income tax to make a reappearance in this context. And as many folks on the call know, the House, which was controlled by Republicans at the time, did pass a provision in 2017 during the Trump administration, which would have specifically subjected state and local governmental plans to the UBIT tax. That provision did not make it into the final product, thanks to the hard work of NCPERS and others. But we did expect it to come back. It's important for people to know that these ideas don't just go away. They're on a shelf, and they've already been drafted in legislative language and scored by the Joint Tax Committee, which then has their methodology to rescore it very quickly. But UBIT did not reappear. We were grateful to see that in neither the House nor the Senate. And I think the inference I would draw with the follow the money predicate is it didn't fit. I mean, if you were to take the alternative investment proposed rule that we'll see in early 2026, if you were seeking to make those investments more widely available, more attractive, you would not impose a UBIT tax on state and local governmental plans, some of the largest institutional investors in the country. That would impact private equity, hedge funds. So it just didn't seem to logically fit. Now, I don't want to draw too much to that because there have been internal inconsistencies in the Trump administration that I think we can all readily identify. So it doesn't mean just because they're headed down a path, great guns, that they don't turn on a dime. So we will, of course, always be on the lookout for any activity related to UBIT. And I think likewise, this, and it is yet to be demonstrated with any kind of behavioral analysis, this fear of Rothification and the fact that heading down that path, right? So you're going to be forced, this would be the proposal, you're going to be forced to make all your elective deferrals in your 401k or 457B under the Roth method. So it's an after-tax contribution, free of tax at distribution. You know, there's always been the thinking that, well, that's going to hurt investment dollars or retirement savings. That the folks seeing it's coming out after tax are going to be less likely to make those same level of contributions. I haven't seen a lot of studies in this area, and if someone out there is aware of it, please share it. But again, I don't think that logically fits. So we didn't see a further move in the One Big Beautiful Bill to further Rothify investments. And I think part of it is that, you know, what's guiding the policymakers is a very pro-investment strategy as opposed to hammering people or mandating that people do certain things. So we'll see how it plays out. Again, I said, you know, there are a lot of internal inconsistencies, and I'm hopeful that they don't catch up with our community.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Angela, any final words relative to looking back to 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think just what I would kind of urge people to pay attention to again, this is true of the last few years, like I said, is just this ongoing conversation of changing pension plan design, and changing features to pension plans as a way to bolster retirement benefits and address unfunded liabilities. There's so much activity in this area, not just at the legislative level, but policy level, regulatory level, in 2025. This was true in 2024. I imagine it will stay true in 2026. So I would say that's just something really to keep an eye out for. And then, you know, workforce challenges, pressures, with demographic shifts, as Tony mentioned, with an aging workforce and increased life expectancy. You know, this is putting added workforce pressures on the public sector, that kind of coupled with, you know, fragile funding status of a lot of pension plans is something that we should kind of be cautious of, and aware of moving into 2026.
Angela, what about proxy voting legislation? We're aware of at least one state that is looking to enact proxy voting restrictions. Are you seeing a trend? I know, and I know a number of states have looked at it previously, but in 2025, were there a lot of activities relative to proxy voting?
You know, there was activity. I wouldn't say that there was a lot of activity. There was more activity in this area last year. I think the biggest trend that we noticed, again with ESG, and something that was, you know, very interesting for us to follow at NCSL, was this huge uptick in legislation related to divestment of assets from specific countries. So yes, there was proxy voting legislation, but not nearly as much activity, at least that we've seen at NCSL in past years, and much more activity targeted around divesting pension assets from specific countries.
Great, thank you. We got a question. How many states have passed anti-China investment laws while the Trump administration is becoming more China friendly? Any thoughts? Oh, I just lost it. Any
Think
thoughts on the anti-China investment bans being reversed?
Angela, do you want to start? And I can.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, at least from what I've seen, you know, and what we've tracked at NCSL, I know there have been, you know, close to 20 pieces of legislation introduced. Of course, not all of those have been enacted. And, you know, again, as the person who pose this question mentioned, a lot of it is targeted around China and this idea that China is a foreign adversary is the way it's being phrased in a lot of this legislation. Personally, I haven't seen a whole lot of reversals. I feel like most of the legislation that has been passed has kind of remained in place. But again, a lot of this legislation has been introduced, is currently pending, has not yet been enacted. But I haven't seen at the state level much reversal. But I do think, it's interesting because this is an area where there is some friction between state and federal policy, right? I think the way that China or some of these other countries are sort of being looked at or being referred to in this legislation as foreign adversaries doesn't necessarily or neatly align with, federal interpretations or federal definitions or trade regulations. So I think there is friction there, and there probably will continue to be. But maybe Tony has some more insights, and it could be that I've also missed some legislation there too.
But there's definitely legislation on the federal level. And in fact, the House yesterday evening passed the Defense Authorization Bill, which goes by the NDAA acronym these days. And it includes new restrictions on China, or essentially codifying what's in place. So you have various covered technologies that cannot be sent to China. And then you have various technologies, a broader perimeter of those where you'd have to notify the Treasury Department as to whether you could make such an investment. Is the Trump administration today more friendly to China than they were last week? You could say that with the NVIDIA announcement that we will sell those chips to China. Will it change in a week? I don't know. I do think Congress, in a bipartisan way, has been very strong on wanting to impose restrictions on China, and not just China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela. So it's a broader pool of nations that would be affected by the provisions in the defense bill. So I do think we're on a path of enacting this type of anti-China or anti-adversary nation provision, but you have the Treasury Department implementing it. So the Treasury Department, of course, are going to be subject to the whims of the president on these types of issues. I wish I could speak with more clarity as to the future of this, but I do feel like it's a moving target.
Great. Let me ask another question that's been posed. What is your opinion regarding the use of private equity funds? Does it increase the risk profile for these pension funds? Has the percentage in private equity funds been increasing? So I'm not sure what the point of the questioner is asking. I would ask, as we're not investment professionals here, does investing in private equity or private markets in I guess from a policy or public policy standpoint or in public discussion bring more of a headline risk profile, I guess, to public plans? Tony, I'll throw it to you first, and then I'll ask Angela to give her thoughts.
Certainly. Well, I would start by saying that, of course, our community is heavily invested in private equity. And that's all I'll say about that as an investment. But you certainly have the headline risk of what the private equity firms are doing with regard to, excuse me, we've seen it in nursing homes, and we've seen it in other healthcare issues in Massachusetts in particular. I think Senator Markey at yesterday's Senate hearing talked about the dangers of private equity in the healthcare world. So certainly you do take on that risk, but do you take on, I'd leave it with a question, do you take on more risk by investing in a private equity company, which has its tentacles in 100 different places, than you do with a major corporation who may not be acting in a way that all constituencies approve of on a day-to-day basis? So do you run more risk I don't know. You're going to have headline risk either way. But I do think recognizing that there are certainly heavy detractors of private equity, and that they will look for opportunities to take a bad situation in which private equity company has been involved in, or one that could be portrayed as negative, say, and then link it to a public pension plan. And I think that is the kind of political pressures that we've seen and we're going to continue to see.
Yep. Thank you, Tony. Angela, any thoughts from your end?
I would agree with Tony. I mean, I think there definitely are risks, but I'm not an investment professional. But I know something that we have seen at least or have heard from folks reaching out to NCSL for support regarding questions that they have about potential risks and potential benefits of investing in alternative assets are questions around illiquidity risk, higher fees, valuation risk. I think certainly there are a lot of risks to be considered. And that being said, we are seeing more and more states allocating more and more of their investment portfolio to alternative assets, including private equity. I think in 2001, it was around like 14% invested in alternative assets, and now it's anywhere from 30 to 40%. There are a few states that are outliers that have greater percentage, greater than 50% of their pension portfolio invested in alternative assets. So I think it is something interesting to talk about and to think about. Again, I'm not an investment expert here, but I think there's risks, and there's obviously a lot of states that are willing to weather the storm and are that believe that the potential payoff of investing in private equity and alternative assets is worth the potential risks. And some states have been really successful, and other states have had issues investing in private equity and alternative assets. And I think as we look at things like digital assets, which is becoming a kind of a hot topic of conversation, cryptocurrency, other digital assets, sort of assets that are very volatile and speculative. I think there's greater risk with those kind of types of alternative investments. So yes, it's risky, and also I think, like Tony said, what investments it's hard to gauge what's riskier, private equity or public equity, or other commodities that pension funds are investing in.
Great, thank you. All
Hank,
right,
I
well,
thought we
that's
were,
a great conversation we've had about looking back at 2025. All right, so let's figuratively turn the page and look ahead to 2026. But before we do, we'd like to get a sense of the priorities for the audience members in the who are tuned in. And so if we could get our second poll up on top priorities for 2026, and we'll give you a few minutes to look it over and vote. All right, I think we give that should be enough time. So let's take a look. Okay, underfunded liabilities, funding gaps. S- uh, Actually, I'm sorry, investment volatility and market risk is the leader of plurality at 41%. Then right behind there is unfunded liabilities, funding gaps, and then legislative and regulatory changes, then demographic shifts and other issues. All right. Thank you, everybody. So let's turn to 2026. And Tony, let me start with you. And a question about one of the questions we got, which is staring the federal government is a funding deadline of January 30th. So what are the things that you're paying attention to in 2026? And then can you speak to the funding gap deadline?
sure. Um, So we are well into this fiscal year, which began on October the 1st. There are 12 appropriations bills, separate bills that must be enacted in order to fund the government. We have enacted 2, and there's hope that others can be enacted before Congress leaves for the holidays, but it's unclear that that will happen. So I think we come back after the holidays, Congress comes back with a real difficult situation. And again, the looming government shutdown. I don't think either party really wants another shutdown. And it's, you can flip a coin as to who came out looking better on the shutdown. I think Democrats achieved their objective, their political objective of shifting the public debate to healthcare, which is important for them because they usually win on that playing field. But I think they took a lot of hits for doing it and for, the daily barrage of the Democrat shutdown that the Republicans were rhetorically using. So I think I think both parties want to avoid it, but there is a real problem coming. And these individual bills are difficult to do. And the added problem in the Senate is that they have a Republican conference rule against earmarks. Congressionally directed funding is the term. But yet the senators want the earmarks, most senators. So we really are facing a difficult situation. There could be another shutdown. And it's also unlikely, all this before I talk about pensions, it's also unlikely before Congress leaves for the holidays that they can fix the problem with the expiring ACA tax credits. So that issue is going to roll over into 2026 as well. 2026 being an election year makes it all the more difficult. Let me go to pensions, which is why we're all here. But that kind of sets the stage for it. I started the conversation by saying that it's very bipartisan public policy area right now for good reason. I think it stays that way. And I do not believe in 2026, we're going to see major retirement legislation. I think we're going to continue from the Congress. I think we're going to continue to see the regulatory efforts spin out. I do think, and I know that the pension councils of the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the Senate Finance Committee are collecting ideas. That's how the 90 provision Secure Act 2.0 was put together. They collected well over 90, but ideas that were bipartisan. And if they could be bicameral and bipartisan, then that's great. And if they could be bicameral and bipartisan and not cost very much, that's even better. So they're looking through those filters right now. Our community should bring ideas forward. I think that's very important. I think one idea that screams, I think, to the top is a public safety worker issue, retiree, which is the HELPS tax exclusion that was set in the law in 2006 at $3,000 per year. So that's an amount that a retired first responder could exclude from his or her taxes if your premiums equal that much for healthcare or long-term care insurance. Very important. But $3,000 in 2006, it was something. If we look at your premiums today, it's not very much. So I think that's an area that will be bipartisan. I don't know what the cost will be to probably double that. It should be at least doubled and indexed for inflation. But that's something that I think we could look at. The other thing I'll add before I turn it back to you, Hank and Angela, is there's a possibility that Congress will do another reconciliation bill. And that's how they did the big, beautiful bill, because that's a procedural protection in the Senate. They only need a simple majority. It's not something that can be subject to a filibuster. Very powerful tool. I really believe that Republicans in Congress will use it again and use it in 2026, put some more points on the board before the elections. I do not think it's going to be heavy on retirement, if at all. Trump accounts were done in the reconciliation bill this year. They're not really a retirement account. In fact, they're not at all. but they could be expanded in a reconciliation bill. So possibly something like that, but I don't see any secure act-like provisions coming through next year. And then, of course, UBIT and Rothification are something we'll watch for.
Thanks, Tony. Angela, how about at the state level? What are the things that you think you'll be tracking for NCSL in 2026?
I think it'll probably stay fairly similar to the trends that we've been tracking in 2025. So, as I mentioned, reemployment after retirement, I think will continue to be a trend as states face workforce pressures and demographic shifts. I think issues around pension funding and solvency investments are something we'll continue to track as well. ESG, I think, of course, is always going to be a topic. I don't think that is going anywhere anytime soon. And something else that I do want to mention, that we've been tracking closely at NCSL is, and Tony just mentioned this, is Trump accounts, baby bonds, some of these other sort of financial security tools that we're seeing gain a little bit more interest and traction. And also, I will say that this is, public pension adjacent, more private sector focused, is it's sort of an increase in activity, and this has been happening over the last few years of states that are interested in and either enacting or attempting to enact legislation to create state facilitated retirement plans for private sector workers who don't have access to traditional workplace retirement plans. We've seen more states do this, a few more states, enact legislation related to auto IRAs or state facilitated retirement plans this year. Minnesota, sort of exciting for Colorado, just recently announced that they're joining the Interstate Consortium of Retirement Savings. They're the sixth state to do so. So that was a recent announcement. That's something that we'll be paying attention to in the coming months. And then another thing, this is also sort of more private sector related, but is certainly relevant, is portable benefits, something that we're tracking really closely at NCSL. More states are showing interest in supporting non-traditional workers, gig workers, platform application-based workers who don't have access to really any type of not just retirement benefits, but any type of workplace benefits. And then the last thing that I'll say is because workforce pressures, I think, are going to remain a pretty big driver of policy at the state level. In addition to reemployment after retirement, we've seen a lot of state legislatures starting to value workplace benefits as instruments to both attract and retain public sector employees. And so there are some prominent trends that we've seen that includes paid leave programs, that sort of include more situations of family growth or loss, giving new hires a higher bank of paid leave at signing, authorizing signing or longevity bonuses, education repayment assistance. So just some different tools I think that we'll be looking out for in effort to address workforce pressures and shortages in 2026.
Great, thank you. And Angela, I'm glad you raised the state facilitated savings for the private sector. It's certainly something that NC PERS has been very interested in for over a dozen years now. Some folks on this webinar may recall that in 2011, we issued the Secure Choice Pensions White Paper that in some ways may have sort of catalyzed some of the activities at the state level for the state facilitated savings. So that's fantastic to hear. Digging a little bit into that, are you guys seeing any trends or activities in terms of which states are getting more involved in the state facilitated savings? Particularly, are there more conservative states that are looking into it versus sort of the traditionally more progressive states?
Yeah, I would say that this is an area, perhaps unsurprisingly, that does tend to be or has leaned, at least in the past, quite partisan. So it's been traditionally, at least, we've seen more blue states, more Democratic states, more willing to consider introducing legislation for secure savings programs, auto IRAs. I think this is changing a bit. There are some states that have introduced, think a few years ago, Missouri, for example, it's not an auto IRA program, but it's, kind of adjacent to that. I think the biggest point of contention is that there's this belief that auto IRAs are a mandate that that there isn't an opt-in feature, or an opt-out feature. And so I think that tends to be where a lot of the tension lies. But 17 states right now that have auto IRAs, more and more states are considering auto IRA programs or programs that are similar. And I think this conversation will continue to take shape in red states as well. It just might look a little bit different, and the types of state facilitated plans that are implemented might not be auto IRAs, but they could be adjacent to auto IRAs or might have different provisions that are more appealing given the political context of those particular states.
Great. Thank you, Angela. All right, so let me turn to the last question that we got. I think I'll start with you, Tony. With the prospect of Congress, the majority flipping in 2026 with the midterm elections, how would that bode for public pensions? And for you, Angela, I'd switch it a little bit. With the midterm elections at the state legislative level, what what might that mean for public plans? So, Tony, let me start with you.
I think it adds a layer of protection. A Democratic House majority always adds a layer of protection to public plans. It isn't that the Republicans necessarily see public plans as enemy, a target, or an adversary, but they can be persuaded that those who benefit from public plans are not their voters, because public employees, teachers tend to not be conservative, although there are many, many exceptions. But we have a harder road with the Republicans. Now, we counter that, I think, effectively through public safety with fire and police. Very powerful voice, and Republicans are very willing to listen to that. But I do think a Democratic majority does add a layer of insulation from any harmful legislation moving.
And really quickly, Tony, there's a question about mandatory Social Security coverage. Are you hearing any conversations about that for 2026?
Not specifically. In fact, there was a hearing yesterday in the Senate, the future of retirement at the Senate Help Committee. Mandatory Social Security did not come up. But, it's going to be on the list of changes that could be made to Social Security to ensure its solvency. It does bring in a lot of money up front because you have new folks paying the FICA tax, but you also create new beneficiaries on the outside. So it's a little bit of a shell game, but to answer specifically, I would say no. But it's too early because they haven't really gotten into the specifics of Social Security reform.
Right. Angela, you get the last word before we sign off.
Great. Lucky me. I think any changes in legislative control that result from midterm elections could shift pension reform agendas. I think, for example, when there are election results that result in a partisan shift, I think priorities could change. So maybe there's a state that's a legislature that is focused really heavily on benefit cuts or austerity measures. And that could shift to, say, expanded benefits or new funding policies. I think it depends really on the majority. So I think for us, really, it's just paying attention to the election results at the legislature level, since they approve pension benefit changes, right? They set budgets. They decide whether or not to adopt structural reforms like hybrid plans or new funding strategies. So, of course, all of that could change depending on the results of the midterm elections, and certainly something that we're going to be paying close attention to in 2026.
With that, I want to thank Angela and Tony for joining us today and giving such thoughtful answers to some very tough questions. And to our audience, thank you again for joining us. I wish each and every one of you a wonderful holiday season, and we will see you at the next NCPERS webinar in 2026. Happy holidays, everyone.
Happy
Bye-bye.
holidays.